Welcome to Climate Forward 2021 at USC Dornsife. We have an exciting week of events lined up with outstanding panelists. I hope you'll join us for as many of them as you can. This past year, due to the pandemic, global greenhouse gas emissions dropped by roughly 8%, the sharpest annual decline on record. But we still saw raging wildfires and the largest number of tropical storms ever registered in the Atlantic. We saw Siberia melt under a protracted heat wave, and normally temperate Texas plunged into a deep freeze. And emissions today are back up to pre-pandemic levels. Large-scale enduring change is the only way that we're going to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change that are coming. Change that requires ambitious policy, government and private sector investment, and the intellectual firepower of our research universities, as well as the passion and commitment of a whole new generation, ready to develop a new way of thinking about global collaboration. The $2 trillion infrastructure bill put forward by President Biden would fund green projects and jobs at levels far greater than any plan in the past. $174 billion to boost the EV market, $100 billion to update the electric grid, plus billions toward R&D for mitigation technologies like carbon capture, and billions more to retrofit homes for minority communities for energy efficiency. It sounds like a lot, but is it enough? And what will it take to get the collective buy-in to make it happen and to make it work? Big changes of this kind will need to be responsive to the challenges and concerns of people across the country and across the aisle. And solutions will need to be developed through inclusion of a wide range of perspectives. That's what this Climate Forward conference is all about. Now in our third year, we bring together leaders from government, industry, and academia to think through bipartisan approaches to the climate crisis. Moving these conversations forward has been a top priority at our USC Center for the Political Future, one of the co-sponsors today. The center is led by two renowned political strategists, Democrat Bob Shrum and Republican Mike Murphy, both of whom will be leading panels this week. CPF has teamed up for this annual event with our USC Wrigley Institute for Environmental Studies, led by Joe Arvai. Under Joe's leadership, Wrigley is expanding its research to explore what I think of as the human factors involved in addressing sustainability issues. He is bringing together our political scientists, economists, psychologists, spatial scientists, and many others to work on this crucial set of problems. COVID-19 has shown us what it looks like to face a crisis that affects every community around the world. My hope is that if there is a silver lining to this past year, it is a deeper and more intuitive understanding of this need for us all to work together. If we can figure out how to move beyond partisan and nationalist thinking and harness the best of our collective ingenuity and creativity, I have no doubt that we can navigate through this climate crisis together. I am looking forward to our first conversation of the week, a climate justice roundtable, and I'll turn the program over to our moderator, Effie Turnbull Sanders.
Good afternoon. My name is Effie Turnbull Sanders, and I serve as USC's Vice President of Civic Engagement and Economic Partnerships. Our department sits within University Relations, led by Senior Vice President Sam Garrison. I'd like to thank Sam and David Galaviz for their support in making today possible. Prior to introducing our panelists, I would like to open our discussion with an important recognition during this week celebrating Earth Day, that the lands upon which we meet virtually have been inhabited for thousands of years by California's native peoples, particularly as it relates to USC, the Tonga people and their neighbors. We would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of Native American First Nation peoples and would like to pay honor and respect to the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this territory upon which we gather virtually, the original keepers of Mother Earth. With that, I would love to introduce our panelists today. We're very fortunate to have Councilmember Kevin DeLeon. I almost started to introduce him as Speaker Pro Tem, as that's how we've met on a number of occasions in Sacramento with the Coastal Commission issues. But Kevin DeLeon is a Los Angeles City Council member currently representing District 14. He's a former California senator and was the first Latino leader of the Senate in over a century, serving as Senate Pro Tem. He previously served for 4 years in the State Assembly And prior to joining the Los Angeles City Council, he served as a Distinguished Fellow for Climate, Environmental Justice, and Health with the USC Schwarzenegger Institute. Welcome, Council Member. Next, we have Jacqueline Patterson. Jacqueline Patterson is the director of the NAACP Environmental Climate Justice Program, which was created to support community leadership in addressing the human and civil rights issues of our times. She has worked as a researcher, program manager, coordinator, and activist, working on women's rights issues, violence against women, HIV and AIDS, racial justice, economic justice, environmental and climate justice. Since 2007, she has served as coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United, a nonprofit member organization created with the goal of uniting women of all ethnicities to invest in the civic, social, and financial well-being of women, girls, and families. We also have with us Dr. Allison Dundas-Rentlin. Allison is a professor of political science, anthropology, public policy, and law at USC. She's an expert on cultural rights, including the use of cultural defense in the legal system. She has served on several civil rights commissions, collaborated with the UN on disability rights. She's also served as a member of the California Attorney General's Commission on Hate Crimes. Welcome, Allison, and welcome, Jacqueline. So we're going to jump right in, and I would like to begin the first question, and I would like to pose it to whoever wants to jump in. This focuses on climate justice. Climate justice is a term that some are not familiar with. To orient our discussion, can you please explain what climate justice means to you? Is that framing of climate justice unique to the United States, or does that have nothing to do with national borders? Who would like to begin? All right.
I'd be happy to begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison.
So it's a pleasure to be here with such interesting and inspiring colleagues. So climate issues are, immense problems of our time, and the United Nations World Meteorological Organization documents these matters concerned with weather, climate, and water. But when we talk about climate justice, we're really dealing with the normative issues on this topic. So when we're talking about climate justice, we're dealing with human rights and what duties communities and states have to try to ensure that, the earth is preserved for future generations. So I think definitely we have to be concerned with climate justice in our communities, but it's has to be a global issue, a transboundary issue. And the United Nations has been working on climate justice. There's a United Nations Declaration on Climate Justice, which emphasizes equality. It says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So there's a kind of egalitarian notion that underlies climate justice. So I think anything that deals with pollution necessarily has to be transboundary. And so that lots of different organizations have defined climate justice. Earth Justice defined it as a term and a movement that recognizes the intersecting links between environmental, racial, social, and economic justice. Climate justice demands that solutions come from this most hit first and worst by environmental harm, and that these solutions be rooted in justice for all people. And I think one of the key ideas is that countries have to help countries that are less affluent. So part of climate justice basically is that the rich have to help the poor, not just within a country, but across borders. And I think one of the main ideas of climate justice is intergenerational equity. So part of the discussion is about how present generations need to ensure that we deal with climate change so that there's justice for future generations. I think we don't always talk about past generations, ancestors, like when you gave the statement about the land. And I think climate justice involves protecting the earth, not just for future generations, but also for past generations.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. I'm going to turn to Jacqueline. Jacqueline, what does climate justice mean to you?
Thank you so much. Similar to the principles and definition of environmental justice, it really talks about the unequal distribution in terms of the burdens of climate change. And when we talk about climate change, we talk about the climate change continuum, from the drivers of climate change, the polluting practices that disproportionately impact certain communities, BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, low-income communities, as well as nations in the global South, in terms of the fact that we are even now exporting some of the polluting, whether it's the coal exports or the liquefied natural gas exports. So on that side of the continuum, and then on the impact side, we also see that BIPOC communities, low-income communities, nations in the global South are disproportionately impacted by climate change, whether it's the extreme weather events, the shift in agricultural yields, the sea level rise. All of those impacts disproportionately impact certain communities, and not just communities geographically, but and in terms of racial justice, but also gender justice. We see that women are disproportionately impacted by it, whether it's gender-based violence that happens in the aftermath of disasters, or the sexual violence that Indigenous women are facing along the pipelines and around the man camps out west. So all of these, there are so many different ways that various communities and populations are disproportionately impacted by the whole climate change continuum. And then the last point I'll also make on that is most impacted and least responsible. I think that point was already made, but the very same communities and populations that tend to be most impacted are the communities that contribute the least in terms of greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change. So thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I loved what you said about the distinguishing between the global South and the global North. And to Allison, it reminds me of a saying that many Indigenous people believe, which is we have to look at the impacts of our decisions 5 generations ahead and 5 generations back, just to look at what that would impact. And so beautiful. Thank you both. Now turn to the Councilman. Councilman De Leon, what does climate justice mean to you? And I think you've got to unmute yourself there.
Well, thank you very much, Effie. It's great to be here with each and every one of you. Climate change is a global problem. It often gets framed in the interest of the global superpowers, overlooking its impacts and sources in developing nations. And those same powers can also be deaf to the concerns and interests of some nations like California and Los Angeles that are closest to the problem and its consequences. But climate justice is the fight for a more equitable set of solutions to this enormous challenge. And that means significant investments in those nations and communities already most impacted by this crisis. Those that are most responsible for this crisis need to carry a greater financial responsibility for solving it and helping those least able to adapt to this new world that we've created. We've always known very clearly that, for example, when it comes to our own Western Hemisphere, when it comes to Latin America, the mass migration patterns, whether it be from Central America because of major disastrous hurricanes. When you look at in Africa and you look at the Mediterranean and the mass migration south of the Sahara, not necessarily from northern Africa, we got some there, folks migrating to Italy, to France, to Spain, to other Eastern European nations. You see a rise in right-wing fascism because of rise of people of color crossing the Mediterranean Straits. And you see the extreme weather patterns, to the point that Jackie made a few moments ago. The extreme weather patterns, where it used to be hot, well, it got a hell of a lot hotter as a result, to the point where you simply cannot live in these environments, and you have to migrate to survive economically. And as a result, they're going to move. They're not going to go south, whether they be in Central Africa. They're not going south. They're going to go north, and they're going to go to where the economic powers are. You see the clash and the conflict. But it goes to the point, I think, is very consistent between so-called first world nations and developing nations is that they have a major responsibility financially, infrastructure-wise, to step up and do everything they can to help assist these nations, that be China, that being the United States, that being the European Union, as well as Russia and other first world nations like Japan.
Thank you. And this question is going to be for Jacqueline. And this will dovetail nicely into some of the comments that you made previously. And the question is, an often cited reason for climate injustice and why it can remain pervasive is that those in underserved communities disproportionately affected by climate change don't have an equal voice in decision-making spaces. Why is that? How can we make sure that we have a truly diverse collection of voices at the table? And especially those who would have to live with the direct negative consequences, as you mentioned before, of climate change.
Thank you so much for that question. So first and foremost, we just put out a report as a second edition of this report, Fossil Fueled Foolery. And in that report, we point out all the ways that the fossil fuel industry uses its might to manipulate our what's really more of a corporatocracy than a democracy. So in terms of influencing with major campaign contributions and really influencing who's in office, and then when folks are in office, influencing the decisions that they make by putting pressure on and by, again, investing millions of dollars in lobbying, and then also even putting pressure as it relates to our courts as well. So we just see so many ways that major corporations have an outsized influence on decision making that then displaces our communities. And so one big thing that we have to do is really campaign finance reform, reversing Citizens United, really restoring the notion that corporations do not have the rights to personhood, and really putting the power in the hands of the people. And then secondly, we just participated in a meeting of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and they have now stood up this new office. It's emerging, the Office of Public Participation. And so we feel these types of mechanisms are critical to make sure that communities are directly engaging in conversations about such consequential decisions that are being made about everything from our energy infrastructure and onward. We have to make sure that we truly have not only a democracy in terms of who we're voting into office and what they're doing, but in terms of public participation and decision making at all levels. So those are a couple things I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know that the councilman is no stranger to these issues around ensuring that community has a voice at the table. I saw, before I get to the next question, I saw Allison raising her hand. Allison, would you like to address this question? Then I'll get back to Council Member De Leon.
Just very quickly, I think the use of these environmental impact assessments are really important to ensure community involvement and that to have access to information so communities can make meaningful decisions. So I think international law also emphasizes the importance of public participation in decision making. So there are treaties on that. So I just think both at the national level and the international level, we really need to make sure that people have access to information so they can participate in these impact assessments.
Thank you, Allison, for that. And now turning to Councilmember De Leon. Again, I know you have done a great many things to increase public participation in the process, particularly around environmental issues. And the question that I have for you is, studies have shown that race is one of the strongest factors in determining who lives in areas of high pollution. What factors have or continue to contribute to these outcomes? Are redlining and other historical segregation policies at play here? Or are there other issues as well? And what can we do about it?
Thank you for the question. Let me say this, is the environmental fight, whether we're dealing with carbon dioxide equivalent CO2, we're dealing with direct tailpipe emissions or refineries. I come to the climate fight from a clean air perspective. And clean air remains the central driver in my advocacy. Decades of discriminatory planning, running freeways through Latino neighborhoods, African American neighborhoods, and other communities of color, and concentrating all of our dirtiest industries in color, in communities of color, have punished generations of communities. For example, right here in East LA, coupled with putting freeways and dirty industries in our own backyards, those communities suffer a severe lack of investment. That's why I spent years working and finally passing Senate Bill 535, which created the Calvin Viral Screen and then invest in heavily polluted communities. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars and not billions of dollars. And we've come a long way since that bill passed. And recently, I was very pleased to see President Joe Biden adopt SB 535 as a template for federal investments across the country to ensure America's most polluted communities, such as mine, have justice and opportunity to clean up their communities. So be mindful about one thing. You know, LA has a reputation worldwide of being a very smoggy city, one of the smoggiest. We have advanced considerably our technologies and our policies as well as regulations. That being said, Los Angeles still remains to be the most ozone polluted city in America, still 10 years consecutively, according to the American Lung Association. And these decisions are made by human beings. They're planners, they're politicians, they're members of at the congressional level, supervisorial, state legislative level, at the local government, city council level. People made decisions. We're going to build freeways in these neighborhoods. And in these other neighborhoods, we're not going to build freeways. We're going to build parks and we're going to preserve open space. In these neighborhoods, we're going to zone for either refineries or polluting industries. But in these neighborhoods, we're not going to. And the correlation is the color of your skin as well as your income level and the lack of voice. And that being said, I think that for, at least at the federal level, I think folks are a little more on it at the local and statewide level. But the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus are really going to have to figure this one out, because I think there's a lot of confusion among themselves still. Some folks are environmentalists, some understand the effects of climate change. Some folks are still, traditionalists with the fossil fuel industry as a result. Even community civil rights organizations, some of them are bought off by, the fossil fuel industry. The 501c3 nonprofits are advocating and carrying dirty water, if you will, or dirty air, metaphorically speaking, for industry. And some folks are, are the sharp tip of the spear. So it comes to race, and it comes to the question of socioeconomics, and how do we reverse generations of historic neglect, intentional neglect, if you will, by those in positions of power. And I think that's why, with President Joe Biden, we have an incredible opportunity to reverse generations of intentional neglect and speak truth to power and use our political power to evoke the necessary changes and transform our economy, where we take folks who historically have been marginalized, vulnerable, who have low-paying jobs and never had an opportunity to go on to community college or a four-year university, that we can put them in a position to have a job in the clean energy space. And last thing I'll say is this, is that that's why California is the fifth largest economy on planet Earth. There's only 4 economies larger than that of California: the United States of America as a whole in the aggregate, China, Japan, and Germany. That means California's GDP is larger than that of the United Kingdom, France, Vladimir Putin's Russia, Brazil, Italy, Canada, etc. So that means with the people of color that we have, to become the 5th largest economy in the world, we had to burn a lot of fossil fuels as a result too. And now we have an opportunity to reverse and transform this economy and also give good paying jobs and bring folks into the middle class. And this is something that we can export to developing nations as well. That's why I always get a lot of phone calls from the Secretaries of Environments of Mexico, of other nations within our Western Hemisphere and other parts of the world, is what are the templates we're doing in California as a subnational government. If Washington, D.C. will not lead, then California will continue to lead and show and demonstrate to the rest of the world. Even though we have our own challenges that we're going to still focus on here, we will continue to demonstrate to the rest of the world that we're a beacon of hope and opportunity.
Thank you, Council Member. Any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that question around the intersection of race and redlining and its impacts on the environment and environmental justice.
I was just going to mention Bullard's, been writing about this for 40 years. His work on environmental racism is really powerful.
Thank you.
Yes, one statistic that stands out from Dr. Bullard's work is that an African-American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $15,000 a year. So that certainly says it all in terms of the race being a critical factor in terms of the presence of toxic facilities. And I would also just say that the history of displacement and of land loss in Black communities and segregation and is really sustained up until now. We see how it plays out in terms of access to transportation, but yet also the more likely to be on the front lines of near roadway air pollution. We know that we also are less likely to have access to even energy, with a higher degree of energy, of electricity shutoffs and so forth, but yet more likely to live next to and be impacted by energy infrastructure. And the history goes back to when people were emancipated from slavery. And we know, right, the year before emancipation, there was the Morrill and the Homestead Acts that actually provided resources for white folks to be able to get land to farm and otherwise. And then once emancipation came, then our ability to actually have the resources to get land, and then our ability to actually have access to legal services to pass down our land from generation to generation. And then I'll just add another challenge as it relates to the intersection of race, redlining, and climate, is the fact that we're more likely to live next to live in a floodplain. So more likely to be impacted by flooding. And then we work with a couple of communities where the FEMA flood program, where they do these buyouts for homes. One of the freedmen settlements that we work with, they actually have had, they were settled in 1865. People are there, descendants from the original emancipated enslaved persons who set up the land there. And most recently, they were declared a floodplain, and FEMA offered them they assessed the land in a certain amount, and then they took off the amount that would cost to demolish the land. And the FEMA buyout program bought those plots of land for $200. Land and homes that have been in these families for generations and generations. And so for us, that really equates to just kind of government-sponsored displacement and land loss for our communities. And that's just one community, one example where this is happening. So that intersection is a critical one. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Jacqueline. It reminds me of the discussion that's ongoing currently right here in our own backyard in Manhattan Beach with Bruce's Beach, and attempts to reach some level of justice, although nothing could turn back the hands of time to really fully compensate the family. But we saw that up and down the coast, the East Coast and the Sea Islands, where enslaved Africans were granted land in some of the most prestigious areas like Hilton Head, and weren't able to keep up with taxes or the intergenerational transfer of wealth. And so we don't have to look very far to see how racist structures and systemic racism and exclusionary policies have kept some people at the bottom of an economic strata for several hundred years. And so thank you for sharing that. The next question relates and kind of dovetails on something that you mentioned, Jacqueline, and the question is going to be posed to Allison. And it's around this idea around distribution of resources. And Jacqueline, you mentioned FEMA and some of the challenges around equity there. Allison, the question that I have is, studies have shown that the effects of climate change are felt all over the world, in poor areas and sometimes in affluent areas as well. Should FEMA and other disaster recovery policies put affluent areas at a lower priority than communities with fewer resources? For example, how does the almost annual rebuilding of high-end homes harmed in mudslides, fires, or eroded beaches and in Malibu and other affluent areas affect how we allocate resources elsewhere? Another kind of twist on this is, how does the almost annual rebuilding of hurricane-ravaged high-end homes in Northern California, Outer Banks, relate to climate justice? And should we keep building back these affluent areas, and sometimes at taxpayer expense, and continue in this pattern of not allocating other resources to urban communities that experience a disproportionate levels of environmental harm?
Well, it's pretty clear that in the interest of justice, that there's no way one could justify that. And obviously the resources need to be allocated much more fairly from a human rights perspective. But it's the premise of the question is that they're finite resources. It could be that we need more responders when there are disasters, so that everyone who's experiencing trauma feels supported within a community. There's certainly many instances of violation of environmental human rights. And I was thinking of the case of Mossville, where the people there experienced environmental disasters, and in the Louisiana with the Cancer Alley, and they filed a complaint with the Inter-American Human Rights System. And the corporation somehow managed to prevent that litigation from going forward. But I think we need to take a more global approach to these topics to find ways to help all the communities that are suffering from climate trauma. And when we get these big victories to try to help people who are marginalized communities, sometimes there are insidious influences that block progress. For example, this human rights and environmental lawyer, Stephen Donziger, won an enormous victory against Chevron. He was representing 30,000 Ecuadorians, many were indigenous peoples. And it was a historic $9.5 billion judgment that he won in the Ecuadorian legal system, which was then blocked. Chevron wouldn't pay, and they've accused him of fraud. He's been subject to criminal and civil contempt proceedings in a really bizarre case. He was even placed under house arrest. And even though there was a victory in Ecuador, and even though the Canadian court, the High Court, ruled that Chevron should pay, he's still under house arrest. So I think one of the problems that we see is that where there are attempts to help people who are in marginalized communities to get access to resources where they've suffered problems because of climate change, the system is not functioning properly. So I do think that the law is part of what needs to be used as a tool. And there are a lot of cases that are being brought by young people to try to address climate justice. And the European Court of Human Rights has a case that was filed by several children in Portugal, young people, against 33 countries. And and the European Court of Justice has another case that was filed by Swiss women, Swiss senior women. So people are trying to use courts as a way to ensure that governments fulfill their responsibility to deal with climate injustice and to allocate resources fairly. So I hope that's a partial answer to your question. I think that we need to find ways to solve these problems. And the other thing I wanted to mention at some point was that the former mayor of Toronto, David Miller, published a book called Solved: How the World's Great Cities Are Fixing the Climate Crisis. And it does talk about what's happened in Los Angeles and many other cities in terms of best practices. So if we're trying to think about how to allocate resources fairly in communities, his book that just came out, University of Toronto Press, covers green building codes, electricity, better public transportation, a lot of the things that we've been talking about.
Thank you.
Effie, I think that we have to take a serious assessment in our policies and our regulations when we refer to the Outer Banks, when we refer to homes that are being constructed or rebuilt after devastating wildfires in very rural areas, when it comes to sea level rise and multi-million-dollar homes, on California's coast. Obviously, we see the devastation of Katrina in Louisiana. We saw what happened in Ward number 9. We saw, I think it was pretty predictable what would happen in Katrina, who would be devastated the most, who would be impacted the most, and why the extreme weather patterns. You saw the Hurricane Harvey in Houston, who impacted the most, obviously, because when we talk about a finite amount of resources and how do we strategically and surgically invest those dollars for mitigation, it will be really critical in communities of color, in Latino, African-American communities, other communities. We see clearly, we see cement, we see concrete, we see asphalt. We see no parks, we see no open space. We see no trees for shade to lower temperatures on these heat islands or sequester, if you will, all of the bad, ugly pollution that our children breathe into their lungs every single day. In the district I represent, for example, I have 9 major freeways, the 2, the 5, the 10, the 60, the 101, the 110, the 134, and the Barack Obama 210 freeway, that just goes right above Eagle Rock from Pasadena. That's 9 major freeways that crisscross a district like a serpent that chokes the air, the oxygen out of a young girl's lungs. Now, for all the Pacific Rim, for example, cargoes that comes in, trade into the ports of LA and Long Beach being the largest ports in the United States of America. If you go to Paducah, Kentucky, if you go to Bloomington, Indiana, and you go to Target to buy a flat screen television set, or even socks, chances are that it went through the 710 freeway and it scarred the lungs of a young Black girl, a young Latina girl, so someone could have a subsidized price point in Midwest or in the South of America. And that is the pollution that we bear with right there. So how we utilize strategically those dollars are be clear. That's why policymakers are going to have to make a reassessment and make hard decisions. Are you allowed to rebuild? Knowing that with drought conditions, with the growth, which is the fuel out there, and then once it gets dry and tinder, it's explosive. Or we're going to continue to spend billions of dollars, when we can better utilize those dollars, especially in communities right now that are suffering the devastating impacts of climate change. Because climate also too is not just carbon dioxide and what's atmospheric. It is not just carbon dioxide equivalent, it's carbon dioxide with NOx, particularly matter 2.5, ozone. That's what impacts us. So the extreme weather patterns in terms of carbon dioxide impacts us, and also the pollution, because it's coming from that same poison is coming from that same tailpipe that's poisoning the lungs of our children too. And last thing I want to say, I mentioned it earlier today, when we talk about the migration patterns, whether it is from Africa, sub-Sahara, north to the European nations within the European Union, in our own United States of America, when you have the debate on so-called quote unquote illegal immigration and how it's politicized and how many folks are forced to move because of hurricanes, forced to move because of drug trafficking, and the voracious appetite that we have on our side of consumerism of illicit drugs and the exportation of firearms and weapons we have on our side of the border to the south within our Western Hemisphere, and you compound that with extreme weather patterns, and you compound that with neo-colonialism, for decades of these nations never had strong democratic institutions, whether it's executive, judicial, or legislative, then that's why you have so many folks coming across the border to seek a better life for their loved ones and for their family. And climate change has a huge impact. And it's funny because no one in Congress gets that it's extreme weather patterns and climate and a lot of the fossil fuel industry that have contributed worldwide to many developing nations of these forced migration patterns just to survive, to put food on the table for your children.
Thank you, Councilman. I'm going to switch over to some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience, and would like to invite folks to submit questions that they may have for the last few minutes of our conversation. One of the questions that came was around the solutions. What are the solutions that we can think of going forward? The question from Elizabeth Fenner was, I agree 100% with the priorities, concerns, and values expressed here, but meaningful correction to the systemic inequities will take many years, and emission reduction is needed now, like without delay, because if not, more drought, more fire, greater destruction, which hurts BIPOC communities the most. What national policies can panelists support that are actionable quickly? Councilman?
Let me say this. I think California is a template, not just for the Washington, D.C., but for the rest of the nation. Number one, you have to decarbonize your grid. That's what we're doing in California with my SB 100%. By the year 2045, all the investor-owned utilities as well as municipally owned utilities have to move clean electrons on their grid. We'll get there by the year 2035 with innovative technologies that advance. Be mindful about one thing. In California, emissions from our grid accounted for roughly 50% of greenhouse gas emissions because we're so dependent on coal, especially coal exportation or importation from other states. Now emissions from greenhouse gases in California from our grid account for roughly about 16%, approximately. So the investor-owned utilities and munis in the South especially are really behind. And we saw what happened in Texas. And we saw what happened with the freezing, weather temperatures and what happened, especially to communities called Black and brown communities in Texas. Number one, decarbonize your grid. You got to do that. Number two, because 50% of your emissions now are from tailpipe, that's electric vehicles now or other types of zero carbon technologies. The one thing I want to underscore is the following. I think Jackie will be 100%, we'll be together in solidarity, is that as we move these policies with a sense of intentionality, with a sense of purpose, if you allow the free market to dictate who gets and who doesn't get, then clearly Black and brown are going to be left out of the latest, the greatest, the most innovative, most progressive, greenest technologies. So if you live in Santa Monica, Malibu, or if you live in Chevy Chase, or if you live, in DuPont Circle in DC or elsewhere, of course, you're going to have a Tesla. You're going to have a Tesla charging station. You're going to have an energy efficient home. You're going to have energy storage. You're going to have solar array panel on top of your roof. But Black and brown communities with concrete, cement, and asphalt will just be broiling under a hot sun, or will be freezing, during the winter time. That's why policies at a national level, we're doing it here as a subnational government right here. But that's why DC has to get their act together now that we have Democrats in both legislative side and the executive branch. They have to seize the moment. If they don't see this moment, if they negotiate against themselves, they're going to drop this opportunity, this huge opportunity. You have to intentionally say Black folks, brown folks who are poor in these communities throughout the country we know are being disproportionately impacted, but will benefit from these technologies, from the resources that we're going to energy efficiency. We're putting Black and brown folks to work. Installation of solar arrays, we're putting Black and brown folks to work, not just distributed generation, but also, utility scale, and get folks into unionism right there. Those are the proactive solutions right there that will have the most bang for the buck to reduce the cumulative metric millions tons of carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalent, which equates to our extreme weather patterns and climate in the United States as well as globally.
I think that President Biden's infrastructure plan that makes racial justice and scientific integrity the twin pillars of his climate program is moving in the direction that people want, that we all want, which is to try to invest funding in minority communities and to try to change, for example, coal mines that have been abandoned to solar energy, so that we have an approach that combines economic policy with concern for climate justice. That seems to be moving in the right direction. This Green New Deal that he has mandated with these executive orders. He's holding a meeting with 40 world leaders. He's set up these different councils, white environmental justice interagency councils to institutionalize climate justice. but also paying attention to racial justice at the same time. So I think that that's good at the national and local level, but the climate justice is a global problem. The climate doesn't pay attention to race or gender. And so we really do need to work within the United Nations system. Thank goodness that we're back in the Paris, agreement system, and that President Biden wants to send the Kigali Amendment to the Senate for ratification. So I think that while we can look at very specific policy changes at the local level, such as are recommended in Dave Miller's book, Solve, we need to try to have the United States take a more proactive role on the global stage to work with other countries, because China and India are also major polluters. And if we really want to deal with climate justice, we're going to need to do so at the global level. I think another major change that needs to come is with media coverage. For some reason, the mainstream media doesn't cover climate justice very much. Public Citizen issued a report on that. So I think it's really important to raise consciousness about this. And that will help to exert pressure on government to adopt the policies we've been discussing.
Thank you, Allison. Councilman, did you want to?
Let me add one thing. Just a caveat. Before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to make sure Washington D.C. actually follows through, and actually completes it. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves in the theoretical. Number one, it's good that we got back in the Conference of Parties 21. Governor Jerry Brown and I represented California, but we need to take the Conference of Parties 21 Paris Accords and actually effectuate it in real change, especially for developing nations. It can't be theoretical. It can't be international law, climate change resolutions that sound good on paper, but in reality never come to fruition. And that's one thing that's very, very key. So we got to get our act together here at home. That's very critical right there. And of course, it's a good thing that we've done the logical thing because of Trump, get back, re-enter the Conference of Parties 21 from Paris in 2015, but also with the other nations, to the point that I think, the professor and Jackie made, the superpower nations are going to have to invest heavily in our developing nations throughout the world, or it's not just going to come to fruition. It's going to be like a United Nations conference. Well, it sounds fantastically wonderful, and then things fall apart, or they just never come to fruition. So it's about follow through, execution, implementation, not just big press conferences and signing a pen on paper.
I totally agree with you, but I think the fact that we've had lawsuits all around the world, many of them brought by young people, is very inspiring, and it should give us hope that the younger generations are going to insist that there is the follow through that you're right, that we should demand. There are all these kinds of coalitions, the U.S. Climate Action Network, the Vision for Equitable Climate Action, all these platforms. The young people have really come together with their various campaigns to be activists for these issues. And so I think that the treaties are not just off at UN meetings. They're being used by young people to bring change at the local level. It's not purely theoretical. We need to use these tools in our campaigns for climate justice.
Thank you. And just a note to everyone, we are at 12:58 and we're going to extend out to 1:05 p.m. Are the panelists able to stay on till then? We had a little technical difficulty at the beginning. Great. Okay. I loved, Allison, what you said about kind of that intersection, the intersectionality of race, class, and the environment, and the fact that we can chew gum and walk at the same time. We can do it. We can consider these factors together. And there's a question from the audience, and I'm going to read the question, and I'm hoping that Jacqueline can kick us off on this. Oftentimes these issues around race and class in the environment get kind of muddled, and we don't really have a full opportunity to have those discussions in a very deliberate way. And I'm encouraged by this panel and hope that this discussion will continue throughout the rest of the programming for this week. But Jacqueline, the question is, it sounds like any attempts to minimize the impacts of climate change must include prioritize discussions of classism, racism, and sexism in order to serve those communities that will be disproportionately impacted. Is it also true that movements surrounding racism and sexism must include conversations about climate change in order to leverage these powerful movements to make global change?
Could you, because unfortunately I did have a hard stop at 5, so I just had to send a message to say, I'm here at 4, so I just had to send a message. So could you just repeat that briefly? Yeah, sorry about that.
Yes, the question was really about intersectionality and looking at how discussions, do you agree that discussions around classism, racism, and sexism have to be included in our larger movements around climate change? And do we need to incorporate climate change into these movements around classism, racism, and sexism to make global change?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry. Yeah, so the very same kind of systemic underpinnings of climate change are the same systemic underpinnings that drive so many of the disparities in our society. So all of the roots are similar in terms of an extractive, exploitive society that's built on kind of this notion of domination and this false narrative around scarcity, and that I can only be well if you aren't well. And so therefore the very roots of oppression that were at the core of the founding of this colony, and so of these colonized lands. And so in order to address these systemic underpinnings, we have to work together as a intersectional movement, as Audre Lorde says, that there's no kind of single issue solution because we don't live single issue lives. It's a bad paraphrase, but so when critical to that is not only just that because the roots are systemic and we need to address the problems at their root, but also if we have a myopic way of dealing with things, then we'll have unintended consequences because we're not taking into account that every action, results in another action. And so we have to be intersectional in our thinking and intentional about weaving those threads together in order to have true change. So I could go on and on at length, but I know we only have a couple minutes, so I don't want to.
Thank you, Jacqueline. With that, I'm going to turn to the speakers to ask folks to provide us with kind of their parting words around maybe some guiding principles or policies that you believe climate change programs should adhere to in ensuring that there are equitable outcomes. And please feel free to share any other thoughts that you have about today. And we're going to give each person about 45 seconds to do that. Jacqueline, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. I will just say that in order, we as frontline groups came together under facilitated by Movement Generation and came up with this just transition framework. It talks about how we have to stop the bad, which is the exploitive, extractive practices, and move towards a just transition to build the new, which is rooted in principles around regeneration. We have a divinely designed earth systems, and if we just lean into those systems as opposed to trying to geoengineer and techno fix our way, that if we just live in harmony with the earth, then we actually will see that ways that we not only live in harmony with the earth but with each other, and we can engage our way out of climate in that sense. But not only so principles of regeneration, principles of cooperation, and again, that is also biomimicry, the ant colonies, the bee colonies. That's a way that they all survive together, is really through cooperation, each one having their own role and everyone towards a common mission of wellness for all. So that we just need to in each of our systems, if we can really build on that biomimicry, then we'll all be much better off. So thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. And to you, Allison.
Well, I'm reiterating some things I've said, which is I think there's a human right to a clean environment. And I think that we need to be enforcing this basic human right within our national systems and at the local level at cities. And so if that includes dealing with climate change, then that's part of this larger vision of ensuring that human rights are really protected, and that would include protecting workers' rights, occupational safe and healthy, guaranteed minimum income, right to the highest attainable standard of health. So I would see that using a human rights framework could help address the injustices that are associated with climate change. I also think we may have to have a more radical environmental ethics. Human rights puts the people at the center of the analysis, but maybe the environment has a right to be protected. USC professor Chris Stone wrote a brilliant book, Should Trees Have Standing? And the third edition talks about whether the climate should have standing. Does the climate have a right not to be, destroyed? So that's a kind of a radical biocentric analysis of environmental ethics instead of anthropocentric. But it could be that we do need to think outside of our usual box in the way that we promote climate justice. And I hope that we can overcome the disdain that we have in the United States for global approaches. I think we're part of the world, and we need to try to make the global local and vice versa. And finally, Elizabeth Cripps argues that we need to raise our children to be good global citizens, good global climate citizens. And so we have a responsibility to teach these ideas. But then I start to think that the youth are the ones who are really taking the lead here. Maybe they need to have intergenerational tutorials. So those are some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. And Council Member De Leon.
I think it's about power. I think it's about political power and how you accumulate political power to effectuate and make the changes that has an impact on the human condition, regardless of who you are and where you come from, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of which God you pray to, regardless of who you love. You have to use power. In California, as progressive and as blue as a state we are, with the reputation narrative we had, it took a tremendous amount of power to move forward with the policies that we have today. It wasn't easy at all, by no stretch of imagination. I think the framework within human rights is good, but I don't know if that respects power, and that's how you achieve the policies and regulatory framework that you need specifically. And I do agree with Allison in terms of global perspective. That's why we have so many, national governments coming to California on a monthly basis to figure out what we've been doing here. So to me, it's about power. And then again, we have to make sure in Washington, D.C., now that we have this opportunity with Joe Biden and a bicameral body that's dominated by Democrats, that we actually get what we expect, what we deserve, what we want, and we don't negotiate against our own, values and our own principles, especially when you have that power. Don't let it slip away at this opportunity right here. So I appreciate it. It's a fantastic opportunity.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here to help kick off Climate Forward in 2021. I wanted to also thank our hosts, the Wrigley Institute for Environmental Studies at USC, the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future, and GROW, and a particular thanks to Erica Maldonado. And I want to leave us with a quote, and that is from Gwendolyn Brooks. And it reminds me of many things that the panelists touched on today, and that connectivity and responsibility for our planet and our fellow neighbors. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.